Hello friends, welcome to my channel 5 Minutes History. In this video, I bring you the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, also known as the October Crisis of 1962, a tense political and military standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US border. This was in response to the American deployments of missiles in Italy and Turkey against the Soviets. Despite the short time frame, the confrontation is often considered the closest the Cold War came to escalating into a full-scale nuclear war. After seizing power in the Caribbean island nation of Cuba in 1959, leftist revolutionary leader Fidel Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union. Under Castro, Cuba grew more and more dependent on the Soviets for military and economic aid. During this time, the two superpowers in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, and their respective allies, were engaged in the Cold War, an ongoing series of largely political and economic clashes to establish their hegemony over the other. As part of this Cold War, the United States covertly financed and directed the Bay of Pigs invasion by Cuban exiles against the Castro government in 1961. The plan was to overthrow the Castro regime and put up a pro-capitalist and pro-US government. But the invasion failed badly and widened the political division between the United States and Cuba. It also pushed Cuba closer to the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. The Americans further infuriated the Soviets by installing Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey surrounding the Soviet border. In order to respond to the American threat, Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev agreed to Cuba's request to place nuclear missiles on the island to deter a future US invasion. An agreement was reached during a secret meeting between Khrushchev and Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro in July 1962, and construction of a number of missile launch facilities started later that summer. The two superpowers plunged into one of their biggest Cold War confrontations after the pilot of an American U-2 spy plane making a high-altitude pass over Cuba on 14 October 1962 photographed Soviet SS-4 and SS-5 ballistic missiles being assembled for installation just 90 miles from the US border. The American nation was shocked. In the emergency meeting of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, President John F. Kennedy was advised to carry out an airstrike on Cuban soil in order to compromise Soviet missile supplies, followed by an invasion of the Cuban mainland. But President Kennedy chose a less aggressive course of action in order to avoid a declaration of war. In a television broadcast on October 22, 1962, President Kennedy notified the Americans about the presence of the Soviet missiles in Cuba. He ordered a naval blockade of the island of Cuba to prevent further missile supplies and demanded that the weapons already in Cuba be dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union. He also made it clear that the US was prepared to use military force, if necessary, to neutralize this perceived threat to the US national security. Following this public declaration, people around the globe nervously waited for the Soviet response. Some Americans, fearing their country was on the brink of a nuclear war, even started hoarding food and gas. On October 24, Soviet ships bound for Cuba neared the line of the US vessels and just stopped short of the blockade. On October 27, an American spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and in response, a US invasion force was readied in Florida. The world seemed to be on the brink of an all-out nuclear war. But after several days of tense negotiations, an agreement was finally reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Publicly, the Soviets would dismantle their offensive weapons in Cuba and return them to the Soviet Union, in exchange for a US public declaration and agreement to not invade Cuba again. Privately, the United States also agreed with the Soviets that it would dismantle all of the Jupiter missiles which had been deployed in Italy and Turkey against the Soviets. When all offensive missiles and bombers had been withdrawn from Cuba, the blockade was formally ended on November 20, 1962. A nuclear catastrophe was averted and the entire world took a sigh of relief. The negotiations between the United States and Soviet Union pointed out the necessity of a quick, clear, and direct communication line between the two superpowers to avoid any mishappening in future. As a result, the Moscow-Washington hotline was established. A series of agreements later reduced US-Soviet tensions for several years until both parties eventually resumed expanding their nuclear arsenals.